Pay attention to this courtroom footage from April 2017. You're looking at 13-year-old Dylan Mercer, shackled in chains, surrounded by corrections officers who look like they'd rather be anywhere else. Notice the face paint, that grotesque clown makeup he refused to wash off even for his own trial. Watch how he stands perfectly still, almost frozen, while the camera captures what would become one of the most disturbing images in American juvenile justice history. The media dubbed him the Funhouse Killer, but the three families who lost everything that Autumn called him something else entirely. This is the story of how a child's obsession with vintage carnival culture turned a small town's Friday night entertainment into a house of horrors that nobody saw coming. You know that feeling when you drive through a small town and see one of those old-timey carnivals set up in an empty lot, and you think about stopping but decide against it? For the people of Ashford, Oregon, the Starlight Traveling Carnival was a tradition they'd welcomed every October for 37 years. Kids grew up riding the Tilt-A-Whirl. Teenagers had their first kisses behind the funhouse. Parents won oversized stuffed animals trying to impress their families. But in October 2016, the carnival brought something else to town. Dylan Mercer was 12 years old that fall. Lived on Maple Street with his grandmother, Carol, after his parents died in a car accident when he was 7. Teachers at Ashford Middle School described him as exceptionally bright, but quiet. Almost too quiet. The kind of kid who sat in the back of the class, never caused trouble, always turned in perfect homework. His grandmother thought he was just shy, maybe still processing the trauma of losing his parents. What nobody knew was that Dylan had developed an intense fascination with circus history, particularly the darker side of it. His bedroom walls were covered with vintage posters of sideshows and freak shows from the 1920s and 30s. He'd spent years collecting antique clown dolls, old carnival props, anything he could find at estate sales and online auctions. Carol thought it was just a quirky hobby, something to keep his mind occupied. She had no idea her grandson was planning something that would make headlines across the country. The Starlight Traveling Carnival rolled into Ashford on October 14, 2016, setting up in the same vacant lot near the highway where they'd been coming for decades. It wasn't a big operation, maybe 15 rides, a dozen game booths, a petting zoo, and the funhouse. But it was enough to bring the whole town out on Friday and Saturday nights. Dylan showed up on opening night wearing a backpack full of his grandfather's old tools. He'd told Carol he was going with friends from school. That was a lie. Dylan didn't really have friends. He wandered through the carnival alone, studying everything with an intensity that should have raised red flags. He watched how the workers operated the rides, where they took their breaks, who worked alone. He was hunting. His first target was James Kowalski, a 43-year-old ride operator from Michigan who'd been working carnivals for 20 years. James was the friendly type, always joking with kids, making sure everyone felt safe on the rides. On October 16th, around 9 in the evening, Dylan approached him during a slow period, struck up a conversation about carnival history. James was impressed. Most kids just wanted to ride the rides, but here was this smart kid asking questions about the business, about the old days. Dylan told James he had something amazing to show him, said his grandfather had been a carnival worker back in the 1950s and left behind a collection of vintage equipment, original funhouse mirrors, mechanical props, things that collectors would pay serious money for. They were stored in an old warehouse on the edge of town, Dylan explained. Would James want to take a look? Maybe give him advice on what they were worth? James hesitated, but the kid seemed harmless, and honestly, he was curious. He told his supervisor he was taking a 15-minute break. He never came back. The warehouse Dylan led him to was actually an abandoned textile factory that had been sitting empty since the 1980s. The inside was a maze of dark corridors and empty rooms. Dylan had been preparing the space for months, setting up what he called his eternal carnival. He'd installed mirrors salvaged from junkyards, rigged crude locks on doors, created a labyrinth that was almost impossible to navigate without light. Once James was deep inside, following Dylan's flashlight through the darkness, the boy made his move. He slipped out through a door he'd marked earlier, locked it from the outside, and simply walked away. James was trapped in a section of the warehouse with no windows, no way out, surrounded by mirrors that reflected his growing panic back at him endlessly. Dylan returned to the carnival like nothing had happened. When James didn't show up for his next shift, his co-workers figured he'd gotten sick or maybe had a family emergency. Carnival workers came and went all the time. Nobody called the police. They just redistributed his duties and kept the rides running. Dylan struck again 3 days later. Teresa Lynn was a 31-year-old from California who ran the ring toss booth. She was saving money to go back to nursing school, working the carnival circuit during the off-season. On October 19th, during her afternoon break, Dylan approached her with the same story. Vintage carnival equipment, possibly valuable. Would she mind taking a look? Teresa was smarter than that. She told Dylan she couldn't leave during her shift. But the kid was persistent, and there was something about his enthusiasm that seemed genuine. She agreed to meet him after the carnival closed that night, around 11:30. Big mistake. Dylan led her to the same warehouse using a different entrance this time. He'd refined his technique. He told Teresa the collection was in a back room, guided her through the dark passages with his flashlight, and then vanished the moment she stepped into a room he'd prepared. The door locked automatically behind her. Teresa was trapped in a different section than James, completely unaware that she wasn't alone in the building. By now, you're probably wondering how nobody noticed these people were missing. Here's the thing about carnival workers. They're transient by nature. People leave jobs without notice all the time. The carnival owner, Frank Russo, was dealing with his own problems that week. Permit issues with the town, a broken Ferris wheel motor, the usual headaches. When Teresa didn't show up for work the next day, he just assumed she'd quit and moved on. But Dylan wasn't done. His third victim was Miguel Santos, a 19-year-old who just started working for the carnival that season. Miguel was from Texas, trying to see the country and make some money before starting community college. He operated the funhouse, ironic considering where he'd end up. October 22nd was a Sunday, the carnival's last night in Ashford before moving on to the next town. Dylan had been watching Miguel all week, noting his schedule, his habits. Miguel usually stayed late to help with teardown, often working alone to secure the funhouse equipment. Around midnight, when most of the crew had left, Dylan approached Miguel with a variation of his usual pitch. But this time, he added a twist, said he had a business proposal, that his grandmother wanted to buy some carnival equipment to set up a permanent Halloween attraction in Ashford. Miguel was interested. Extra money sounded good, and the kid seemed legit. Same warehouse, same routine, different locked room. 3 people trapped in an abandoned factory, slowly dying of dehydration, screaming for help that would never come. And Dylan Mercer, 12 years old, going home to his grandmother's house like he'd just spent another evening at the carnival. The Starlight Carnival left Ashford on Monday, October 23rd. Frank Russo finally reported 3 of his workers missing to the local police, but he filed it as a routine notification rather than a missing persons case. He figured they'd just quit without notice, which was common enough in his business. The Ashford police took the report and basically filed it away. Adults had the right to quit jobs and leave town. Nobody was looking for James, Teresa, or Miguel. Not yet. Meanwhile, Dylan was basking in what he considered his greatest achievement. He'd return to the warehouse every few days, always at night, always careful to make sure nobody followed him. He'd installed peepholes in each locked room, tiny holes drilled through the doors at eye level. He'd sit in the darkness and watch his performers, as he called them in his journal, through night vision goggles he'd bought online. In his twisted mind, he'd created art. He'd preserved 3 people as eternal carnival workers, trapped forever in his funhouse. He took notes on their behavior, sketched pictures of them in different stages of despair. His bedroom became a shrine to his project, filled with drawings and observations that would later make investigators physically ill. But here's what made it even more horrific. Dylan started selling tickets. Let me paint you a picture of how insane this got. Dylan began spreading rumors at school about a real haunted warehouse on the edge of town. Said it was the most terrifying place you could imagine, better than any Halloween attraction. He charged kids $5 each for a tour of the building, leading small groups through the safe corridors on weekend afternoons. The children had no idea they were walking past rooms where people were dying. Dylan was careful about which paths he used for his tours. The locked rooms were deep in the warehouse, far from the routes he showed the other kids. He'd installed fake cobwebs, hung up creepy decorations, played sound effects from a battery-powered speaker. The kids thought it was amazing, the coolest haunted house ever, and their classmate had built it all himself. Word spread. Dylan made hundreds of dollars that October. His grandmother noticed he suddenly had cash to spend, but figured he'd been doing odd jobs around the neighborhood. She was just happy to see him socializing with other kids, even if it was something as morbid as running a Halloween attraction. What nobody understood was that Dylan's psychiatric condition, later diagnosed as a severe dissociative disorder with sadistic tendencies, had fully taken over his personality. He'd created an alter ego he called the Ringmaster, complete with the face paint and costume he'd eventually wear to court. In his mind, he wasn't hurting people. He was creating a permanent show, giving these carnival workers immortality as performers in his eternal funhouse. The calendar flipped to November, Halloween passed, the weather turned cold, and 3 people were still trapped in that warehouse, clinging to life in the darkness. James Kowalski, the father of 2 from Michigan, died first. Approximately 11 days after Dylan locked him in that room, his body simply gave out from dehydration. Teresa Lynn lasted 13 days, writing goodbye messages to her family on the walls with her fingernails in the pitch black. Miguel Santos, the youngest and strongest, survived 16 days before his organs finally shut down. Dylan documented all of it through his peepholes, drew pictures of their final moments, wrote in his journal about how dedicated his performers were, how they'd given everything to his show. On November 8th, Dylan visited the warehouse and found all 3 of his victims dead. Instead of panicking, he felt satisfied. His project was complete. The performers had given their final shows. Now they could rest as eternal parts of his carnival. He locked the warehouse and went home for dinner. But here's the thing about small towns. People notice when strangers disappear, even if it takes a while. Frank Russo, the carnival owner, kept getting calls from James Kowalski's family asking if he'd heard from him. James had never gone more than a week without calling home. His wife was frantic. His kids were asking questions. Something was very wrong. Teresa Lynn's roommate in California had filed a missing person report in late October. Miguel Santos's mother in Texas hadn't heard from her son in weeks, which wasn't like him at all. The families started connecting dots. All 3 had last been seen in Ashford, Oregon. All 3 had vanished around the same time. By mid-November, the Ashford Police Department had 3 separate missing person cases on their hands, all linked to the same carnival that had left town weeks ago. Detective Sarah Chen caught the cases and immediately knew something was off. 3 experienced carnival workers don't just vanish simultaneously. They don't abandon their belongings in the carnival's communal housing. They don't ignore desperate calls from their families. Something terrible had happened in Ashford. Detective Chen started with the basics. She interviewed every carnival worker she could track down, talked to locals who'd attended the event, pulled surveillance footage from nearby businesses. The carnival had set up near a strip mall with a grocery store that had cameras covering the parking lot. It was a long shot, but she reviewed hours of footage anyway. And there it was, October 16th, around 9:15 p.m., a young boy walking with James Kowalski toward the edge of the lot, heading in the direction of the industrial area. The footage was grainy, shot from a distance, but it was clear enough. A kid and an adult, walking away from the carnival together. 3 days later, same camera, different timestamp. The same boy, this time with a woman matching Teresa Lynn's description. Same direction, same industrial area. October 22nd, the boy again, now walking with a young man in a Starlight Carnival jacket, Miguel Santos. Chen felt her blood run cold. She had a child on these tapes, apparently the last person seen with all 3 missing workers. She enhanced the images as much as possible, zoomed in on the boy's face. The face paint made it harder, but she could see he was young, maybe middle school age, wearing distinctive clothing that might help identify him. She started showing the images around town. "Do you recognize this child?" It took 3 days, but eventually a teacher from Ashford Middle School came forward. She recognized the backpack, the build, something about the way the kid walked. She thought it might be Dylan Mercer, one of her students. "Quiet kid," she said. "Smart but odd, really into creepy stuff." Chen obtained a warrant to search Dylan's home on November 18th. What she found in his bedroom made her want to burn the whole house down. Walls covered with sketches of the warehouse interior, detailed drawings of 3 people trapped in rooms, labeled with dates and times. A journal filled with observations about his performers and their dedication to the show. Maps of the warehouse layout with specific rooms circled and labeled Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3. Most damning of all, the night vision goggles and 3 personal items that belonged to the victims: James's wallet, Teresa's bracelet, Miguel's phone. Carol Mercer was in complete shock. She'd had no idea what her grandson had been doing. The warehouse visits, the tours he'd been running, the collection in his bedroom. She'd never thought to question any of it deeply enough. The guilt would haunt her for the rest of her life. Police descended on the warehouse that afternoon. What they found inside was beyond anything they'd prepared for. 3 bodies in 3 separate rooms, in advanced stages of decomposition. The walls scratched and bloodied where the victims had tried desperately to escape. The complex system of locks Dylan had installed, the mirrors creating endless reflections of horror, the peepholes he'd used to watch his victims die. The forensic team worked for days documenting everything. The timeline became clear through the evidence. Each victim had been lured to the warehouse, locked in a room with no food or water, and left to die slowly while Dylan watched and documented their suffering. The cause of death for all 3 was severe dehydration, but the manner of death, the deliberate torture of it, made seasoned investigators break down in tears. Dylan was arrested at school on November 19th. He was sitting in math class when Detective Chen and 2 uniformed officers walked in. The entire class watched as he was led away in handcuffs. His face showed no emotion, no fear, no surprise, no remorse. Just that same blank expression he'd been wearing in the courtroom footage that would later shock the world. During his interrogation, Dylan was eerily cooperative. He confessed to everything immediately, speaking about his crimes with the detached curiosity of someone describing a science project. He explained his philosophy about creating eternal performers, about preserving carnival workers in his permanent funhouse. He showed no understanding that what he'd done was wrong, only expressing disappointment that his show had been shut down before more people could experience it. Psychiatrists who evaluated Dylan were stunned by the severity of his condition. He'd been living with an untreated dissociative disorder, trauma from his parents' deaths that had never been properly addressed, and emerging sadistic tendencies that had gone completely unnoticed. The face paint wasn't just a costume, it was his way of separating his ringmaster identity from his everyday self. The legal questions were unprecedented. How do you prosecute a 12-year-old for 3 calculated murders? Can a child that young understand the permanence of death, the suffering he caused? The district attorney's office spent weeks debating whether to try Dylan as an adult or keep him in juvenile court. They ultimately decided on adult court. The premeditation was too clear, the cruelty too extreme. This wasn't a child who'd made a terrible mistake. This was a child who'd carefully planned and executed 3 murders, then documented his victim's suffering like a researcher conducting an experiment. The trial began in April 2017. Dylan's defense team argued diminished capacity, childhood trauma, mental illness, every mitigating factor they could present. The prosecution countered with the journal, the sketches, the testimony from kids who'd paid Dylan for warehouse tours while people died just rooms away. They presented the surveillance footage showing Dylan calmly luring each victim to their death. And then there was that courtroom footage, the media image that captured Dylan in full face paint, shackled but composed, surrounded by corrections officers who looked more disturbed than the defendant. He'd insisted on wearing the makeup to court, claiming it was part of his identity as the ringmaster. The judge had allowed it against everyone's better judgment, thinking it might help the jury see the depth of his delusion. Instead, it made him look like a monster. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The families of James Kowalski, Teresa Lynn, and Miguel Santos attended every day of the trial, sitting together in the front row, united in their grief and their need to see justice done. James's wife, Patricia, gave a victim impact statement that left the courtroom in silence. She talked about her children asking when Daddy was coming home, about the missed birthdays and holidays, about the nightmare of not knowing what had happened to her husband for weeks. Teresa's parents flew in from California. They'd lost their only daughter to a child's twisted fantasy, and they struggled to comprehend how something so evil could exist in someone so young. Miguel's mother spoke through tears about her son's dreams of college, of the future he'd been working toward before a chance encounter with Dylan Mercer destroyed everything. The judge sentenced Dylan as an adult, though the sentence would be reviewed when he turned 18. He received 3 consecutive life sentences with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The judge stated that Dylan would remain in juvenile detention until age 21, then transfer to adult prison. Whether he'd ever be released would depend on psychiatric evaluations and evidence of rehabilitation. Dylan Mercer is currently held in a secure juvenile facility in Oregon, where he continues to receive intensive psychiatric treatment. Reports indicate he still doesn't fully understand why what he did was wrong, though he's learned to say the right things to his therapists. The face paint has been replaced with ordinary clothing, but those who work with him say the disconnected affect remains. He talks about his crimes with clinical detachment, as if describing something he witnessed rather than orchestrated. Carol Mercer sold her house in Ashford and moved away, unable to face the community where her grandson had committed such horrors. She established a foundation in the victims' names, funding mental health services for children who've experienced trauma. It's her way of trying to prevent another tragedy like the one her grandson caused. The warehouse was demolished in 2018. The city couldn't find anyone willing to buy or repurpose a building with such a dark history. They erected a small memorial garden on the site, with 3 benches dedicated to James, Teresa, and Miguel, 3 people who went to work one October and never came home. Dylan Mercer was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of kidnapping, and 3 counts of felony confinement. He received 3 consecutive life sentences with possibility of parole after 30 years. James Kowalski was 43 years old. He loved classic cars and coached his kids' Little League team. Teresa Lynn was 31, a talented artist who drew portraits in her spare time. Miguel Santos was 19, a young man who wanted to be a nurse like his mother. They were real people with families who loved them, dreams that would never be fulfilled, and futures that were stolen by a child who saw them only as performers in his twisted show. This is their story, and they deserve so much better than the end they got. May they rest in peace.